the Beloved wrote God is light. If Richard Koepsel says God is light, it's a very different matter. It's the same words. Words have the same meaning, but the experience of the words is very different. The experience of the word varies according to how much life, how much spiritual being one can live into the words. So when Christ Jesus says, I am the light, it's a very, very different thing in terms of magnitude than if I say Christ is the light. If I say it, it might even sound trite. Because if you try to say something that is so deep beyond yourself and you don't have the life that you can live it into existence, it sounds trite. It sounds just like a bunch of platitudes. That doesn't mean to say that I'm a bad person or that I'm base or that I'm not spiritual. It's just a recognition of the fact that, relatively speaking, I can't live the life or the light into the words so that they, in turn, live more than self. I'm saying all of this because I've been reflecting on the last few talks. And in those talks, I've been trying to go into things that I find that are so deep and that they're so beyond me that in trying to say them, that it begins to sound like gibberish. There are things that I'm pointing at, only they're so distant and they're so lofty that I just can't live it into existence. It's been fruitful because it is filled with creativity. Because of that, it's very fertile. So I decided that I have to change pace a little bit. And we're going to go on to Zurvanism, but in order to change place, to change the pace of things, I'm going to do something else that I was going to do toward the end of the year. Of course, we're near the end of the year anyway. I want to read something from American Indian mythology. And then we'll go back to Zurvanism, and maybe we won't be so hyperextended. I have this lovely, rare old book that I found years ago. Not even sure where I found it, but it's really a very good book. It's falling apart. It's actually from a school in Rogers Park, Illinois. It was one of their castaways. It's called The Indian Myths, or Legends, Traditions, and Symbols of the Aborigines of America, compared with those of other countries, including Hindustan, Egypt, Persia, Assyria, and China. It's by a woman named Ellen Russell Emerson, and it's a very good book. I want to read a story out of there, including her introduction to it, which is very nice. It's only about 5 pages. Concerning the origin of evil and its personification. As the pious Marquette journeyed along the Mississippi, his eye was often offended by remarkable pictures on the tall cliffs that border the river. These pictures, he concluded, were of a diabolical nature. They reminded him, he said, that the devil was lord and paramount of the wilderness. A remarkable description of the origin of one of these so-called lords of the wilderness is found in a legend discovered among the northwestern tribes. I believe it's a misprint. It should be the northeastern tribes. And this is a translation by a woman called Mrs. E. Oakes Smith. And it is attributed to an American Indian named Iagu. and regards a very accurate portrayal of the way that the Native Americans thought. It's called The Evil Spirit, a Mistake of the Great Spirit. Jerry. Mitolak, or Long Island, was formerly a vast level plain that, having once been overwashed by the sea, was exceedingly smooth, and it seemed like a large sandy table. It was upon this plain the great Manitou, the master of life, worked out his creations undisturbed, for the sea encircled him on every side. Here he formed those early creations which were of such gigantic size that he himself found it difficult to control them, for he always gave to each certain elements the laws of which they controlled until he took back their life to himself. Here also he would frequently try his creations, and giving them life, would set them in motion upon the island, when, if they did not suit him, he would withdraw their life from them before they escaped. These are now seen on this island as little lumps or green tussocks, where the great Manitou had commenced some immense quadrupeds, and finding them unsuitable for his purpose, had destroyed them on the very spot whereon they had been formed. It was in this manner that he constructed his animals. He placed 4 cakes of clay at proper distances upon the ground, and slowly worked upwards as one constructs a canoe. After the animal was finished, he dried it a long time in the sun. Then, placing an opening in its side, he entered it and remained many days. When he came forth, the shivering creature swayed from side to side, shaking the island by its motion. If his appearance was pleasing in his master's sight, he was allowed to depart upon the north side of the island, passing through the sea to the opposite shore. At one time, the great Manitou occupied himself a long time in building a creature of marvelous size, which was an object of great curiosity to the little Manitos who often visited it. But it was still more curious to the Punkwujnis and the Nibanabas, who found amusement in hiding behind its ears or capering along its back, sometimes sitting within its mouth, perched upon its lower teeth, while the foolish little things thought the great Manitou could not see them, for he was deeply absorbed in his work. They're talking about nature spirits here. It's one of the few books that talks about the hierarchies of nature spirits, fairies and such, and gives the Native American names. But the great Manitou can see all things. He can see through all creatures he has made. Notwithstanding with which the great Manitou worked over the animal, it proved too large for his taste. Beside, he was unwilling to give life to a creature that would have so much strength, so he concluded to leave it where it was. Thus neglected, the weight of the monster caused it to sink partly down into the island, where it hung supported by its head and tail. After this, the great Manitou amused himself by making very small creatures, but on finding that they were not so attractive as the Pudgewudgeons and Nibanabas, he would receive their life into himself and then cast their bodies within the frame of the unfinished animal. In this way, a great variety of odd-shaped things were hid in what was called the Rokaman, or place of fragments. One day, Kitchi Manitou molded 2 pieces of clay into 2 large feet like those of a panther. He did not make 4, there were but 2. He slipped his own feet within them, and was pleased to find their tread was light and springy, so that he might walk with noiseless speed. In taking his feet out, he made a pair of very long legs, These he caused to walk. Finding their motion was easy, he fastened upon them a round body covered with large scales like an alligator's. But the figure doubled forward, so catching up a black snake that was gliding by, he fastened it to the body and let it wind itself about a sapling nearby, which not only held the body upright, but made a very good tail. The great Manitou had made the shoulders broad and strong like those of a buffalo, covering them with hair, and making the neck very short and thick and full at the back. Thus far the Master of Life had worked with little thought, but when he came to the head, he reflected a long time. He took a round ball of clay into his lap and worked it over with much care, musing deeply, patting the white at the top of the ball. He almost forgot the work to be done, for he was considering the panther feet and buffalo neck. Thus the ball became very broad and low. Reflecting upon the sports of the Pajwudjanis and the Nibanabas, who had made the eye sockets of the great unfinished animal a sort of gateway out of which they leaped with much merriment, he concluded to make the eyes like those of a lobster, and then the creature could see on all sides. The forehead he made broad and low, and the jaws were set with ivory teeth and were made heavy and strong, with gills on either side. Sure sounds like an Atlantean, doesn't it? An exact description of an Atlantean. The nose was like the beak of a vulture, and a tuft of porcupine quills made the scalp lock. Here the great Manitou paused. Holding the head out at arm's length, he turned it from side to side. He passed it rapidly through the air and saw the gills rise and fall, and the eyes whirl, and the beak look keen, and he became very sad. He had never made such a creature, one with 2 feet, a creature who should stand upright and see on all sides. He had resolutely placed the head upon the shoulders. Night now approached, and with it a tempest arose. Heavy clouds obscured the moon, and winds swept over the island in fierce gusts. The beasts of the forest began to roar, and the bats skimmed through the air. A panther approached, and with 1 foot raised and bent inward looked at the image, smelling of the feet that were like his own. A vulture swooped down and made a dash at the beak, but the Manitou brushed him away. Then a porcupine, a lizard, and a serpent, each attracted by a likeness to itself. The Master of Life veiled his face many hours while the strong winds swept by him. Seeing that like attracts like, the idea grew into his mind that he would have some creatures who should be made not like the things of the earth, but after his own image. Many days and nights he reflected upon this. He saw all things. Now he raised his head. He noticed a bat lit upon the forehead of the image, with its great wings spreading on either side, and then he rose up, took the bat, and held its wings over the image's head. Since then, the bat, when he rests, hangs his head downwards. He then twisted the body of the bat from its wings, having taken its life, by which means he held the bat over the image's head. The whole thin part of the bird fell down over its forehead like a hooded serpent. The great Manitou did not cut off the face below, but went on, making a chin and lips that were firm and round, and that they might shut up in a forked tongue and ivory teeth. He knew that with the lips and chin it would smile when life was given it. The image was now entirely completed except the arms, and the Manitou saw that with a chin it must have arms and hands. He grew more grave, for he had never given hands to any creature, but he did not hesitate. He made the hands and arms very beautiful after the fashion of his own. The work was then finished, but the Master of Life took no pleasure in it. He began to wish he had not given it hands. Might it not, when trusted with life, create? Might it not thwart even himself? He looked long at the image, The Master of Life saw that what it would do should he give it life. He knew all things. Now he put fire into the image, and a red glow passed through it and through it. But fire is not life. Terrible and fierce was its aspect. The lobster eyes were like burning coals, and the scales of its body glistened with fierce light. The Manitou opened up the side of the image. He did not enter. By his command, the image walked around the island of Mythology that he might see it move. But now he put a little life into it, but he did not take out the fire. He saw that the creature's aspect was very terrible, but that it could smile in such a manner that it ceased to be ugly. The Manitou dwelt long upon these things and finally decided that such a creature, made up mostly of beasts with hands of power, a chin lifting its head upwards, and lips holding all things within themselves, must not live. Upon this decision, he took the image in his hands and cast it into the Ronkamen, the place of fragments, but he forgot to take out the life. The fall was great, and the creature lay a long time without motion among the discarded creations that had been thrown there lifeless. When a long time elapsed, the Master of Life heard a great noise in the Ronkamen, and looking in, he saw the ugly image sitting up, trying to put together the old fragments that had been cast within the cavern. He gathered a large hump of sand and stones and closed up the mouth of the Ronkamen. The noise now grew louder, and when a few days had passed, the earth began to shake and hot smoke issued from the ground. The Manitous of the sea and land crowded to Manitowak to see what was the cause of the disturbance. For the first time it occurred to the Manitou that he had forgotten to take the life from the image he had cast within the cavern, and therefore he came to watch the result of his mistake. And while he and the Manitou stood by the cavern listening to the noise, which continuously increased, there suddenly was a great rising of sand and stones. The sky grew dark with wind and dust. Fire ran along the ground, and water gushed high into the air. Terrified by these sights, the Manitous retired with fear, when, with a great rushing sound, the image came forth from the cavern. His life had grown strong within him, fed by the burning fire, and at the sight of him every earthly creature trembling hid while filling the air with their cries. The Manitous fled the island shrieking, "Machi Manito, Machi Manito." It was the evil spirit. That's one Native American version of how evil came into being. It's a very shortened version. I'd like to read the whole long story of it, but I assume that the translated source is probably very hard to find. We won't dwell on it. We'll just make a few comments just to get into the feel of it. In some ways, it's like the Bible story that we observed last year. There is an evolutionary production of greater and greater forms, a progressive evolution of forms. You might say that the Manitou becomes better at creation from doing more of it, and the creations get better. However, it's also like our story of Ahriman and Ormazd in Mazdaism that we were looking at, in that there are forms of progressive perfection that rise from the earth, while life and intelligence from the Great Spirit come down from above. We said that there were two kinds of forms, the forms of Ahriman, which are like the forms that we see, and the good forms of Ormazd, which are something like the Platonic forms, which are the creative ideas from which things spring. The part that's most interesting relative to what we're talking about is that the Spirit forgot or repressed the fact that it had put its own life into it. Then in time, it matured into an evil, rebellious spirit, just exactly like our Ormazd and Ahriman story. The creature was like an early human, something like an Atlantean, but it was human-like. It was biped, it was upright, though not strongly upright at first. It had a strong jaw, so it was willful, or at least desireful. And it was articulate in both the hands and the tongue, or the lips. It had all-seeing eyes, which indicates it was something like Atlantean. And strangely, it brought a fear or anxiety to the gods, to the Manitous. And it is that fear or that anxiety that we're going to go into now, because fear and anxiety plays a large part in the story of Ahriman and Ormazd. I was going to bring some pictures, but I didn't get the time. In fact, I didn't get as much time put into this talk altogether. Next time we'll have pictures, though. So we'll start telling the Zervan version of Mazda myth. And it's a very shortened version again. And it's taken from a whole bunch of different sources, so we have only paraphrases. Zervan is the one, the all. Zervan is the coincidence of all the opposites. They're all within itself. Light and darkness, good and evil, male and female, and almost like the stanzas of Dzyan, bliss and misery, order and disorder are all one in Zervan. Zervan is eternal and lives by and in itself. However, as the story goes, it's something like one of the stories of Brahma Prajapati that we talked about. Zervan is something like lonely, and he wishes for a son. Zervan sacrifices, and the sacrifice is something like a repression. He sacrifices his creative powers for 1,000 years, and he does so without success. And then he begins to doubt the efficiency or the efficacy of his sacrifices. At the end of the 1,000-year period, mind you now this, he's sacrificing his creativity. In most of the stories of Hinduism, the demons practice celibacy and they practice self-contemplation until they're so full of themselves that they think they are greater than the gods. But here, the All-One sacrifices his creative power and forgets about himself. He thinks about a son. So at the end of the 1,000 years, the wife of Zervan, which is actually the feminine side, because the being is an androgynous being, because all the opposites are in it, gives birth. But she gives birth not to one son, but to two. The son that is the product of Zervan's love and desire and sacrifice is Ormazd. The son who is the son of Zervan's doubt is Ahriman. You see, this is really an intellectual, almost a neurotic story. The doubt on the part of Zervan, and that becomes coincident with the creation, causes a kind of fall for Zurvan, because henceforth all of the honor that used to be paid to honor and sacrifice that used to be paid to Zurvan is paid instead to Ormazd, who is the pure son of love and desire without any doubt. We'll stop there. It's going to take us at least 2 weeks to get through the story. We'll go on a little bit further later on with the story, but we have to have all of these interlocutory commentaries, I guess. It's really very, very beautiful story. Zurvan is something like a supreme being, but even more than a supreme being, because it's a para-Brahm, or a para-supreme being, because it goes beyond the manifest being. It comes to the topic when we look at the doubt of Zurvan. We come into the very thing they are here. I thought that I was scooping everything, and the Mazdaists had it over 2,000 years ago. But it's like we've been saying, that when being knows itself or contemplates itself or is awake to itself, there is some kind of anxious realization or doubtful realization of the limits of its waking and of the potential of expanding those limits by going beyond. The limitation in this story, the limitation of consciousness, is expressed in two ways. It's the doubt of self, that is the doubt of creative potency, which can paralyze one. That's what writer's block is, people who become exceedingly intellectual and begin to think about their thinking process and are all wrapped up in themselves and withdrawn into themselves, into self. Those people doubt all of their creative capability. And the limitation is also seen in the desire for the Son as a new self, an extended self. So this is a trying to get beyond self, that is, to get beyond into that realm of chaos, that almost para-Christ-like consciousness that we've been talking about. That if one gets even beyond selfness, one is getting to that perfect disorganization from which all organization is created. In this assertion, creative assertion, the doubt becomes very objectified. It becomes very, very clear. In a way, since there is doubt in what is known, that doubt issues from the process of self-knowing, it's not hard to get rid of doubt, because it's not hard to sacrifice knowledge, I should say, to doubt, because you know that there's limits to your knowledge. So it's easy to make that sacrifice, and he does. It also shows how insipid knowledge is. It's almost profane saying what we are saying, and what we have been saying is that even for the one, that is, for the one and supreme being, that to live unto itself and its self-knowledge is in some way insipid. Knowledge is like that. You know it already. So this, in some way, gets at the very root question that Jim asked last time when he was here. Why sacrifice? In part, he sacrifices because he's insecure. But sacrifice, like everything else, as long as it's part of the process of ongoing creation, but part of the process of ongoing awakening, is two-sided. On one hand, he sacrifices to satisfy doubt, or to satisfy anxiety or loneliness, or the need to extend himself, which is a need. On the other hand, he has a love and a desire to give and to sacrifice. So from the Ormazdic side, right in the very process of beginning the sacrifice, it is a giving kind of sacrifice, and it's a creative urge of love. In either case, this sacrifice is dualistic. It's a sacrifice to some potential within and beyond self above. It's like saying that God is God to God because it can sacrifice to something greater within itself and thereby sacrifice for something like a sun or like a creature that is below itself. So it's a dual kind of sacrifice. And so it is a double sacrifice, and for that reason it's doubly good. The 1,000 years probably don't represent 1,000 years. What they represent is something like in the story of Manitou that we just saw now. It is a repressive incubation period. There might even be a logic to that kind of limitation in time that each of us has, or that each facet of our being has its own period, that if we project our creativity into the different depths of our own being, the incubation before they come fruitful differs from realm to realm. So 1,000 years is an age, and it's a nice term. The birth is a manifest dualism. It's no longer in spirit. It's no longer in potential. It is a manifest dualism. In this regard, the story is like the original work of the Mazdaists from the Buddhism. Things proceed where Ahriman is first a very shadowy figure that is a principle, or maybe even the vague notion of a principle, and then becomes a distinct being. And so there's something about birth that the whole idea, like there's a big difference between pregnancy and birth. I don't know how to say it any other way. It shows the extremely difficult but subtle problem of going from monism to dualism, even if going from monism to dualism is a perpetual process. And so we're going to be talking about that again. I don't even know at this point whether there is anywhere an unchanging awareness that is in no way affected by anything that happens in life or evolution or anything like that. I can't even say. I read a lot of spiritual and religious texts that say there is an unchanging divinity, but I just can't understand or say whether something like that exists. At any rate, what it shows is when there is an action of any kind, automatically there is dualism. Whether it is this kind of reflective projection from a being that is previously subsistent, even whether it is a dreaming, it is an action. In fact, the principle of karma is sometimes called the law of action. That any time that there is an action, there is automatically a dualism. Now, it's really beautiful how the manifest doubt from the unaware or pre-aware spirit becomes a negative sun, and how resistant matter that what I'm trying to say is that when the dream is projected, it becomes the negative sun, but it actually makes possible. It's like saying that our consequences make possible our causes. That it is only when we put something forth into the unknown, and it takes that form of the doubt, because we really have to be honest and say there are things that we don't know, and that it could be this way, that when we make that kind of projection, it congeals a resistance. But that resistance and that aping of us, that mirroring back to us of our own insecurity as something negative, how the struggle of that is what makes possible the realization or the fulfillment of the dream that we had in the first place. It's really extremely beautiful. It's hard to tell who is the negative sun, whether it is Ormuz, who is all good, or whether they say like they're both good suns, is what I'm trying to say. Because Ahriman, even for all of his resistance, turns out to be a very positive thing. However, we must not worship that, because if we worship our own negativity and materialize our own negativity, we're immediately lost, because the knowing consciousness is more in the Ormazdic consciousness, and there must be that interaction between them, or there isn't going to be any new consciousness. That's all what we see all around us in nature, is the kind of loss or abandon of self to Ahriman, and materialism is not a very healthy thing. The concept is carried a step further when, as a result of the doubt, Zurvan loses his honor and all the sacrifices which are now given to Ormazd. This is another statement of dualism. It is as if to say that dualism cannot be created without some kind of abstracting removal from it, such that the more one is aware of the very painful dichotomies of doubt or of any kind of creative action, that one becomes at the same time removed from it. Well, it just brings me back to a dream I had last night, where the dream was painful at the same time that I was removed from it, from the pain, and it both was and wasn't painful at the same time. So this is another way of looking this projection, reflective projection into dualism, is another way of saying that in that reflective projection, the reflective projector has then a once removed advantage, and there's a kind of cleanness to that also, so that Ormazd isn't the only one that has a cleanness. It also shows how once you get involved in dualism, you can lose your potency if you put yourself right into the dualism. It also shows how this is indeed a fall. What is beautiful is that when a person voluntarily sacrifices, that the free and volitional automatic dualism automatically creates, the sacrifice automatically creates a vertical dualism. If Zurvan as the one is self-possessed and self-contemplative, everything is good, bad, everything is. and everything is filled with purpose and purposelessness, but it is also in some way stagnant and dead. However, if one projects, then there is a life that is a true life. It's a vital struggle, and even if it is filled with back and forths of doubt, it is alive. If one were to remain self-absorbed, all progress would stop. Or if one were to be so projected directly into the manifest of resistance, one would be dumbfounded. We see that happening around us all the time. People are so possessed of matter and of possession of matter that they lose all meaning because the loss of the ormazdic consciousness or the Zervan consciousness of knowing the meaning and intent and purpose of things is lost to form because one is fascinated by form. It's one of those things that there is a great fascination with evil, and there's a great fascination with matter and with stuff that we can get all lost in it. So so there's a lot of doubt, but it is a living doubt, and it brings forth a lot of waking activity. I want to give an example of it from Hamlet, which isn't exactly on what we're saying, but it's really something we've done before and may well do again. It's the famous Hamlet speech. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep we say end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, to dream, to sleep, perhaps to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, the spurns that patient merit of unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from those whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience makes cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickled o'er with a pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you now, and that goes on to Ophelia. But you can see the same principles are there, and only in this case Hamlet is looking from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The whole idea of losing action to diffidence and the thinking back and forth, the loss of time, and the problem of whether there is any reality to the dream. He very neatly notes Krishnamurti's thing that we'll take all kinds of pain and suffering rather than give up the known for a dream that is unknown to us. It's very, very exceedingly insightful. I want to note an analogy to another dream. Brahma, the creator, became the creator by sacrificing his all to the creation. But because of it, he has no temples of worship and sacrifice. The parallel is so similar that the stories that explain this tell it from the folk point of view, from the worldly point of view. They claim that, they, meaning the followers of Vishnu and Shiv, claim that Vishnu and Shiv almost took on the role of Ahriman and were like marauders. And what they did is that they overturned all of the temples of Brahm, and after that Brahm was almost unknown, even though ultimately puissant. And it's the same idea that in the giving of self to dualism there is a transcendence or a rising above in the appeal to something beyond self, within self, in order to make the sacrifice, the action that produces the vertical dualism, that one becomes invisible and becomes behind it all. This is what is behind the myth that we've talked about quite often, the myth of the invisible father or the invisible root behind things. All right, it's time to get back to the story and tell a little bit more. Ormazd is the son of Zurvan's love, desire, and sacrifice, and he becomes the god of goodness and light and life. Ahriman, the son of Zurvan's doubt, is the god of cold and dry and evil things. Zurvan plans to give nothing to Ahriman. His intent is that he's going to bestow everything on Ormazd, who does get the worship and the consideration, who is the love child. However, Ahriman is dark, and so he reads Zurvan's dark intentions, and he thrusts himself out of the womb first. And he claims rule of the world by the right of primogeniture. That is, the firstborn gets the rule. Zurvan, in turn, is horrified by this, and he exclaims, "My son is light and fragrant, but thou art dark and stinking." Not the normal thing that you say at the birth. So, for a time, Ahriman obtains rule of the world, the phenomenal realms, but the moment of his destruction and the triumph of Ormazd is set. That's as far as we're going to go with the story tonight, but we're not going to even be too long. We're already over halfway through the notes. It's always difficult to face the open consequence of our dark thoughts. Zurvan has difficulty even facing his loneliness and even facing doubt. How much more difficult is it for us, not being like Zurvan, to face what are sometimes intentionally negative or even harmful thoughts? I want to look at a few little things in here. The first one is the olfactory metaphors that were used at this part of the story. Fragrance is usually pretty easy to understand, and it has a very traditional meaning. Fragrance usually represents the essence of experience. When experience is sacrificed, the essence of it rises up to the spirit to feed it. And so that's soul material. That's easy to understand. But stink and stench is another matter. If we look at our senses, sight and sound are, or seeing and hearing are impersonal senses. We see things at a distance, we hear things at a distance, we don't have to be in contact with them. Being impersonal and capable of impersonal objectification, they represent senses that are more of the spirit. Because like Zervan, they can be once removed and invisible to the whole creation and see the whole creation. Smelling, tasting, and touching are personal senses. Touching is probably the most personal because you have to come personally in contact with it. It's also the most generalized, and it's also the most inaccurate. There are places on the body that you can touch a person with a pin and you feel it as much as 1.5 inches away. You might know the exact distance. That the nerves are so far separated from each other in the back that you can feel something almost 1.5 inches away from where it's actually happening. Smelling and tasting are chemical. They're intimate because we do have to touch, and they have to do with our very physical well-being. Our food, it all depends on how it smells or how it tastes. So, according to the spiritual scientists, smelling and tasting are associated with the lower desire world and with the lower desire body. Because smelling and tasting have a quality of attraction and repulsion about them. And in the lower desire world, there is both attraction and repulsion, whereas in the higher desire nature, there is only attraction. So, good food smells good and tastes good, and so we're attracted to it. Things that are unhealthy or poisonous are often things that are rotting and putrid, and they are repulsive to us. In fact, they're even revulsive to us. They're also aromanic because they're a product of death and decay and decadence and relate to all of those non-green plants that we've talked about before that reverse the whole flow of evolutionary progression. They raise by tearing themselves, by tearing other things down, which is a very good description of Ahriman. By fragrance, bees and other insects, sometimes even birds, but they do it by color more than by fragrance, forward the creative process through pollination. So there's something very, very positive there. What we have been saying is that in the human-like state, or after that, one can project across void or mind and be creative. We have been saying all along that with dualism there is a danger of a loss of wholeness, a loss of waking self-consciousness in projection. We have also been saying that there are two types of projection, or two flavors of it. One being a creative, reflective projection, and one being an unwholesome, pathological projection, which we see in psychology, where the things that we refuse to admit to, we say belong to someone else. We see ourselves and others, and we don't like what we see. Zervan doesn't like to see his doubts manifest as Ahriman, who is stinking to him. And usually there's counter-projection that goes along with that. We neglected to say last time, or didn't say so thoroughly enough, so it's going to be said this time and repeated, that if there is unwholesome projection, the best way to break it up is by reflection. Because when you reflect back on yourself, you can see that there's something of yourself that has gone into the projection. To state things really very briefly, if there is singular reflection, one of two things happens, depending on which side of the void you are. If it is a withdrawal into blissful self-contemplation, a kind of spiritual narcissism, a withdrawal, that's one kind. Or if there is an egotistical self-absorption in personal self, it leads to a huge kind of separatism and inversion. So it isn't surprising that when the consciousness is withdrawn and Ahriman is thinking in terms of himself as he must, that he would be revulsive, because he is projecting himself and not reflecting on his spiritual nature or on the consequence of his deeds. He's reflecting on himself in this kind of narcissistic egotism, and he's projecting out his own ambitions. And as a result, when he projects that out, that self-assertion becomes something of a repulsion. We don't like to be around people who are always trying to take things for themselves. They push us off by pulling things to themselves. And Ahriman, or the Ahrimanic consciousness, is when we try to pull or draw things to ourselves personally, and in that state, we're stinking. It's self-assertion, it's desire in the worst form. Perhaps it is even the fact that Ahriman has to be the firstborn isn't only due to selfishness, but maybe even there is a pre-realized assumption in that the need to create in the first place was born out of loneliness or out of anxiety or out of insecurity. And maybe that's why Ahriman becomes the one who asserts himself first. So that brings us now to some contradictions. Remember that Zurvanism is a form of Mazdaism. And in Mazdaism, Ormazd is supreme and first and primary. In this story, there are a number of contradictions, as dualism is always going to have. And some of the contradictions are internal and some are external. In the rest of the night, we're going to talk about contradictions in the Zurvanistic story. We mentioned earlier that Mazdaism became exceedingly powerful, and it became strict and powerful at the same time. We mentioned that the Mazdist priests had capital authority. That is, they could kill heretics. It's not surprising then that we find in our times people like Ayatollah Khomeini that with that kind of extremism and that kind of strictness, and even projecting an external Satan, which is just projecting an Ahriman. In Jimmy Carter in the United States, Iran to this day still sees us as a Satan. Zurvanism was an attempt to moderate this severity. And it went right to the root of the problem in order to try to moderate. That is, it tried to co-opt or swallow whole dualism with a pre-existent or preeminent monism. That is Zervan. That Zervan is the one out of whom the two were born. Clearly, to Orthodox Mazdaists, this was considered heresy. So, the primogenesy was an outright external contradiction. To say that there were two, that the two were the result of one, that in itself was a contradiction. And to say that one was born before the other, which is because that has a primacy of order, that's altogether different than when Ahriman and Ormazd are born at the same time, or even in the more vague sense of when Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are born at the same time. So this is heresy at big time. In Orthodox Mazdaism, Ahriman makes his appearance later. Ormazd knows about him way beforehand, and he's slow to awakening to even the existence of Ormazd. So this primogenesy of Ahriman must have been exceedingly shocking. It might have even been more shocking than the fact that there wasn't a monism, because monism is easier to take. You know, it's always satisfying to know that there is a oneness that we're all part of, but dualism is always, you're always anxious. You're always, so the monism might have been, they might have been able to take, but the idea that Ormazd came first, that's too much. I want to talk a little bit about the whole division. In our time, the dualism is alive and thriving in our times. In modern philosophy and modern psychology, it's called the mind-body problem. The philosophical materialist questions whether there is any reality to mental existence, which means they question even their own theory. They say that it might all be a hallucination or an illusion, because ultimately it is just the product of sophisticated but nonetheless just interactions of matter. That's what's happening in our brain, or what happened in the brains of our forefathers, is a result of all of our deepest prayers, or of our imaginations, or our creativity. That's just a result of matter interacting together. On the other hand, the philosophical idealist, like Bishop Berkeley, questions the reality of matter. Because if I'm in my prayers, and if I am at one with the Spirit, the material world doesn't even seem real, and the experience of it isn't real. And this has been a problem in modern philosophy and modern psychologies. Modern psychology is, for the most part, is physiology. It believes that everything is downright materialistic. Carl Jung tried to deal with the problem. He tried to sidestep it, or he tried to swallow it whole with his concept of synchronicity. He said, yes, there were two realms, the psychological realm and the material realm, but that they were perfectly parallel to each other with no vertical connection. That is, that they were each reflections without projections, that they were separated from each other and each lived in a solipsistic realm. But because of this stance that they were parallel and the two, yes, they would rub against each other, but there was no vertical connection. Because of this, wanting to maintain this, because it fit in with his whole psychological philosophy or philosophy of psychology, he did come down on the side of materialism in his treatise on synchronicity, which is one of the latest things that he wrote in his life toward the very end. He says there can't be any causal connection between the two worlds. Because if there were, there would be magic. And we all know there is no magic. And in fact, he even goes so far as to say that the unconscious part of the psychological realms we can't even know. In fact, he went even so far as to say there was one of the greatest magicians of his time, Ramani Maharshi, was right in town, right down the street, and Carl Jung not only would not go and see him, but he even wrote a treatise why he wouldn't go and see him. He was not really strong on either magic or meditation or even prayer for that matter. It is true that a lot of white magic is accomplished by impingement and by emanation, but still there is a lot of direct, even white magic. It is not until we have that kind of consciousness, the mind-body problem is going to be with us. Are our thoughts really about reality? Or does all of this really have a meaning? Or is this just a meaningless task? Those kinds of thoughts are going to divide us until we can do what the alchemists call the great experiment. Until we can creatively change matter from the realm of the spirit, until we can wake up on the other side of that parallelism, on the other side of that synchronicity, and directly cause changes we won't know. And the more that we are in control of ourself, our spiritual being, and capable of control of every aspect of our life, the more we can bring that breakthrough into being. Let's talk a little about the internal contradiction. We've talked now about the contradiction of how the Zervan story conflicts with Mazdaism in the earlier sense of it, but now let's look right in the story itself, because there is an apparent internal contradiction, and I want to deal with that. And that is the internal contradiction of primogeniture. Without examining that principle, it is clearly a contradiction whether one is a Mazdaist or not. But let's look at it sort of as a Mazdaist. All Mazdaists believe that Ormazd ultimately prevails over Ahriman. The light prevails over darkness, and good prevails over evil. If that is true, then primogeniture at face value cannot be true. Primogeniture is the belief that the firstborn is superior and most fit and most worthy to inherit power, and that every succeeding generation after the firstborn is less fit. Now, this cannot, if this is true, then the first is at the beginning and everything else is downhill. It's decadence. If this is true, there's no progress. It's a very Ahrimanic world after that. Maybe that's why Ahriman does win. If there's no progress and everything is downhill after the firstborn, how is Ormazd to prevail if it's all downhill, if there's no progress? primogeniture is really a principle that is of spiritual cosmogony, and it has nothing to do with heredity. I think it is a great confusion that humanity has associated it with human, who's born when in the family. Now, it is true that there is progress. And it's also true, we can see it. I'm a second-born. We can see that very often second-borns or third-borns are more capable. And so the whole notion of primogeniture can't be true, because there's no demonstration that the firstborn is any better. As a principle of spiritual cosmogony, primogeniture has more to do with space than it does with time, at least with linear time. When the one realizes the dream by reflective projection into the unknown, in what is called cosmogony, or the materialization of the spirit, it does so by limiting itself in time, but it does so by immersing itself in space, into that potential, into that unknown, which spirit does right within itself. It finds a nest of space within itself, and it immerses itself in that. As the spiritual known participates in reflective projection into the unknown, the dichotomy between the known and the unknown becomes increasingly clearer, becomes more distinct. Both what is known is more clear, and the dream and the unknown are also more clear. That is, they become more dense. The materialization of spirit means that in space, matter becomes condensed. The dream or the ignorance becomes condensed. And it becomes more resistance. Ahriman fights back. Now, we're not going to go into a big, long exposition of this process, but there are just several simple points we want to make about it. One is that this is for real, as the statement goes. It is, in one sense, continuous. That is, the spirit projects itself deeper and deeper, or projects into the unknown and densifies things as deep as it can go, until it is has gone as far as it can go. But it isn't just like a stone wall, because you got to remember, spirit is threefold. If it were just willing, it would go until it reached the end, and the whole of evolution would be an impact process. But because the spirit has as its function more than just will, it has thinking, and it has loving as part of its powers. It turns out that the assertion or the exertion or the projection of spirit into the unknown, when will has gone as far as it can go, it seems like a logical conclusion to the thinking facet of things. You realize that you say, this is as far as I can go. Logically beyond this, I don't see anything. So this is the last conclusion. Maybe in some other evolution, or when we grow up a little further, we can carry it further. What happens in spirit is what happens in us. Also, since loving and feeling is another power of the spirit, it feels like a creative climax. It feels like, and it was good. And it has that feeling of having been carried as far as it can go. So part of the realization is that we can't extend and we can't realize unless we give it everything we have and then some, because we're calling on something beyond ourselves, within ourselves, to be able to do the creation in the first place. In another sense, it is not linear. It is more analogical, because things step down. That is to say, analogically, that there are logical steps, but each step is a replication of a higher step, only with a different principle. So it is something like in music, only just the opposite of the way we experience music now. See, we experience music from an harmonic point of view. We hear tones and overtones going higher and higher. From the viewpoint of Zervan, when there is a creation, there is a pitch, and then there are undertones. And these undertones become the states of reality, which have a logical nature, which have a beauty right within them, and they represent steps of the application of will, like what are called in physics critical points, where something changes from a solid to a liquid or from a liquid to a gas. Those are states of change between one minor plane and another. And each plane has its own horizontal logic that is total within itself, and it has an analog to a higher plane going all the way up to the highest, or all the way up to the first. So there are there are also horizontal shock waves, just like there are vertical shock waves that represent the different realms or planes of existence, but that would be so far off topic. It's interesting in terms of astronomy and astrology, but they're a little bit far off. The intervals that become the realms, seen as spiritual or material, are planes. They're sometimes called worlds or planes or levels of existence. Sometimes in the mysteries they're referred to as generations of God, or sometimes as the degree of the fall of God into matter. That this is a much bigger fall than the fall that we talked about last year. The original emanation of the one within itself, from beyond itself, that is previous or is root to all analogy, that is right at the beginning, that collapses on itself for its own creation, is called the alone begotten. Sometimes in Christianity it is also called the only begotten, because it was the only thing that was created. But the better word is alone begotten, because the one created it out of itself, in itself. It is also called the firstborn. And this is where the nature of primogeniture comes from. In this sense, primogeniture is perfectly sensible. The higher, the closer to the one which stands behind it by having sacrificed and having to reach beyond itself, to sacrifice, that reaching beyond itself, made it aloof above the vertical dualism of spirit and matter as the creative projection went down into the material existence. The things that are closest to the one are ormazdic, and they are more in the consciousness of spirit, of meaning, of purpose, and they do more of the controlling. So the principle of primogeniture, in terms of those kinds of generations, makes a lot of sense. So you can see, realizing it from this point of view, the notion that Ahriman was the firstborn is indeed stinking, dark, and repulsive. The shock was probably even more terrific to the ancient people, because the ancient people tended more toward a blissed out escapism than they did toward being lost in matter. There was even some reluctance to come into matter, so there was the Luciferic being blissed out, not our kind of, we now have more the Ahrimanic temptation of being absorbed in matter and losing ourselves there. We sort of dumb out in our escapism in matter. The thing is, this wasn't just a religious political diatribe, the notion of Zervanism. This is a myth. It had to have something to it. So the question we have to ask ourselves is there any reasonable way that we can see or consider Ahriman as being the firstborn? Or was this just sensationalistic heresy? From the viewpoint of the modern mysteries, the answer is a very clear yes. There is a way, and a very important way, and it has not to do from our point of view of being locked in matter, but there is a very important way that Ahriman is the firstborn, and there is a reason for it, and something that can be applied rather well in our lives. It's also a relatively simple answer. The reason for that is because last time we worked it all out. We began talking very clearly about reflective projection. We said that void or mind or pre-conscious mind acted as a reflective mirror and as a projective lens. It's something right now we can't see this clearly because we are seeing things only from the mirror side and only the lower mirror side. We see only the material limited conditions. We really are harmonic. We don't often understand. We can't say like Paul that there's one glory there's a glory to a different glory to each star, or that there is a higher purpose or meaning, because we're pretty much locked into, mechanistic things. How does this motor work, or how does chemistry work, or something of that nature. We're pretty locked in here. In a way, it is something like one of those two-way glasses that you see, that you could either see through it or you can reflect off it depending on how the light hits it. Right now we're only seeing it in reflection, and we're seeing it from the lower reflection. There are two movies that I think that deal with this issue really nicely. There's one called Paris, Texas, where this man has the breakup with his wife, the tip of the tongue, on the tip of the tongue is the creator, the man who made the movies. He's the one that made those 2 movies about angels. German. No. Wim Wenders, yes. He did Paris, Texas. And the other one is Red, by the Polish movie maker that just died a year ago. What? Yes, Krzysztof Kieslowski. Both of them use the 2-way. He eventually finds his wife, and she's working in one of these sex parlors where you can look through the window and see the woman, and you can talk to her like they talk to people in jail. And, she's supposed to undress or say provocative things to you until your time is up, and then you have to leave. But he finds her, and they find a way to project the glass so that she can see him, project light on the glass so that she can see him. In Red is really interesting. This man is in love with this woman, and he screws up somehow, and she's going out with another guy. And he sits there at the window of the restaurant where the 2 of them are, and he's sitting there smoking a cigarette in the red. All throughout the movie, whenever there's an important point in the movie, the color red comes out really strong. And as he draws on the cigarette, it gets bright red. And the camera has such an angle so that you're looking through the window and seeing the other couple happily inside, and you're seeing him drearily reflected off of the glass. But it's that kind of thing where you can reflect and see yourself, and you can project through and see the other. So we know psychologically, as we said before, that it's unhealthy to only project because we lose ourselves. Similar, it is unhealthy to only reflect because it's some kind of escapism. Regrettably, we didn't say a lot about that last time. For true psycho-spiritual health, we have to both project and reflect both ways. Here we go to that terrible picture again. This one we'll leave open-ended because it's spirit. This is the eye of the mind, or the void, and spirit projects through to matter, and it reflects back to itself, and creatures reflect off of the mind so that they don't have to deliberate on everything, and they take their memories and take them back up into spirit. So the really healthy life is something like a lemniscat, where one is going back and forth between the realms of spirit, and there is both projection and reflection. Anything less than having both active simultaneously is likely to be unhealthy. We said last time that the spirit leans toward the void in a process called involution, or the materialization of spirit. And as it does so, the matter reaches upward, or forms in the matter reach upward toward the void, toward spirit, just like Ahriman goes toward his pinpoint of light. And strangely, just like in our Native American story, how the creatures get taller and taller and are reaching more toward the heaven of Manatu. As this takes place, as spirit comes closer to matter, the forms become more supple, more responsive, and the spirit awakens more and more potential. This process comes to a dramatic change in a human being where there actually is the meeting, where there is the pinprick of light, and the spirit can be inside the form, or at least see through it, and the form can on rare occasions look through and see the pinprick of light. For the other creatures, the forms come close to the spirit, and the spirit comes close to the form, but there isn't that same waking self-consciousness. Well, this process continues. That after the human stage, or as the human stage progresses and goes on to higher levels, the spirit comes more and more into the forms, and the forms live with the spiritual intent. And immediately or continuously in the moment, as things are experienced in the form, they're immediately understood in the spirit, and there is not a struggle between spirit and personality, but there is a dialogue, and one reflects in a way that's efficient, or the spirit is more self-conscious of its own deliberations as it is acting and living in the forms. This is a real life. This is the difference. The difference between a saint and somebody like us is that the saint can bring that spiritual intelligence all the way into life, and then life takes on a different meaning. It's almost like a myth gets lived out, and it's a really very full life. So, all right. In the mystery schools, the modern mystery schools, both are present at the same time. The principle of primogeniture and the principle of reflective projection. That is to say that as the spirit is going down, or as the generations of the different worlds are going down deeper and deeper into matter, at the same time the reflective projection is taking place, so that it's something like this whole lemniscat is sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into the worlds, and then it turns around and goes back as the spirit draws it back into itself simultaneously as all of the form is being taken into the matter. So both are present at the same time. The descent or the generations of God, or the falls of God, and the reflective projection where the spirit becomes materialized and matter becomes spiritualized, and there is a waking creative consciousness that goes on at the same time. Not only are both taking place at the same time, but the spiritual projection, reflective projection, takes place in waves. It isn't just a one-time, once only, so that there's a wave after wave after wave that is going into involution and evolution, so that there are all kinds of different grades and stages of spiritual development, all the way down to those, I like those names that the Native Americans had for the nature spirits. It's almost got me interested now in trying to dig up some books that show their whole listings of Manitous and nature spirits. So there are all sorts of angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. It's turning out that tonight we should be serial tonight, because I put in 1 hour of work for each member of the class. So each one should get an hour and then tell the story to the next. Now, since all of this is taking place at the same time on the spirit matter pole, on the cross, so to speak, of creation, that is vertical and that has its horizontal limbs, as we go up, climb up and down the tree of good and evil, as well as the tree of life, that in all of this, since it is a vertical dualism, it is important that perspective is always important. We must look at perspective. We have to remember again that we're in the phenomenal side of things with an almost opaque mirror lens from all of this. Our story, whether it was the story of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, or of Ormazd and Ahriman, the stories are told from the material point of view because that's where we are, because they are a means by analogy of bringing that light down to us that we don't see through the mirror. And this is the reason why it's always in terms of Ahrimanic terms. We say Ormazd destroys Ahriman, and it always has to have that point of view. This is why Ahriman has to be first. Our first waking experience when we are born now in this time of stories and of symbols is of matter. Is of matter and is of form. I don't know that it's right, but that whole idea of that the first thing that a child does when it's born in this world is aware of pain and cries out. This is a kind of primogeniture. There are two functions, there are two principles, and we have to keep them clear. Since we left Orthodox Zoroastrianism, when we were talking about Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, at that time we were talking about horizontal dualism. Now we're talking about vertical dualism. And vertical dualism is significantly different from horizontal dualism. Vertical dualism is not symmetric. There is a limit to matter, whereas to spirit it is unlimited. It is open. Matter exists for and by limitation. Another difference between the two is the difference that we're examining right now. The difference between reflective projection and primogeniture from the 2 points of view. In the phenomenal realms, the work is receiving. We experience. Our work here is to experience the unknown, to interact with it even in destructive ways. The work in the transcendental worlds, the work of the creators, there are no creatures in the transcendental worlds, is giving. And that's creation. It's a totally different perspective. The vantage is different from the worlds that we are in the phenomenal worlds, where matter is the first experience and limitation is the first experience, the Ahrimanic realms. Everything is from the bottom up. And one cannot be successful in the experience of life in our work here as experiencers unless we work from the bottom up. From the vantage of the spirit, from the creative vantage, it is from the top down. And they're very different viewpoints. One cannot try to experience something that one has not built up to fundamentally. You have to have the simplest objective material experience, and you build from that. You can't experience something beyond yourself until you have thoroughly experienced what you have now. You have to work your way up. In the spirit, it's just the opposite. one must draw deeper and deeper from the Spirit and always work from the top down. The first attribute of the Spirit, according to the Platonists, and it agrees with the Hindus, I know they think they had it first, is that the first attribute is the Creator. The second is the emanator, and the third is the fabricator. And so it always works from the top down. You cannot create unless you draw from the deepest creative force in yourself. In that regard, we are no different than Zervan itself, because Zervan, in order to have a son and to make the sacrifice of his creativity, to do so, had to go beyond himself and had to follow deep into self, or into spirit. Is probably a better way. I don't like self, because self doesn't really exist in that way. One cannot reverse these perspectives. You can't create something greater from something lesser. Nor can you create from a lower level of creativity in yourself without the original will to be. It just isn't there. This is the weakness. We see it all the time. This is one of the reasons I don't read science fiction. Because science fiction is all bottom up. You know the example that the scientist creates a machine that's smarter than him. And from then on in, he is the slave to the machine. That's totally incredible. How can something less smart make something smart? You can't make something smarter than yourself. However, if you draw on a creator, because mind you, we have this star of Ahriman, that one little pinprick of light. We can draw on something deep in the spirit in us, and in that way we can interact with the forms of matter and we can draw them up. So it's a very, very important thing that Ahriman must rule. It goes right to the very whole creative process, because the first attribute of the Spirit in potential is the first thing that we developed, and that is the divine Spirit. But we could not even develop that potential of Spirit until first we had been mineral-like and experienced resistance, being resistance and, being creatures like stones banging against each other or sustaining forms for other people to live in, just like it is the, you might say, the stubbornness of the calcium that allows me to stand here without falling into a puddle. So experience always comes first, and out of that experience, when it is drawn into spirit and reflected, then the potential of will is drawn out of that. Until then, we're depending on the divine will for the general, collective, universal will when we are mineral-like. When we experience vitality and growth, then after that, we unfolded the life spirit, the potential of the life spirit. We haven't really even waked these into full realization yet. So not only is it true from the viewpoint of spiritual philosophy that there is a primogeniture, but from the perspective of the world as we see it now, and from the perspective of creatures, and we have to become creatures before we can become creators, from that perspective, it is important that Ahriman comes first, that we recognize limitations, and from those limitations there are objective experiences, and those objective experiences awaken in us the potential of creativity, so that rather than living on the borrowed experience that is built into us by the creative beings that we can live on our own. So, experience becomes before the potential of new creativity, which comes before new creativity. So this is not a chicken and an egg thing, because the chicken was always there or is always there, and it is always part of an ongoing process. But in order for it to grow, it's got to lay the egg, and we have to have the experience. And if we think that in our lives that we can just go flying off into other spiritual worlds, if we think that it's just a matter of something happening to us that we are going to become spiritual, we are wrong. That if we think that we're going to do like they think we can do in grade schools now, skip about 5 or 6 grades, you can't do that. You have to start with experience, and the experience that we have now is a reality. And I think the more that we can self-consciously appreciate the Ahrimanic experiences that we have now, that primogeniture, and let Ahriman rule as Ahriman must. Don't worship it. Don't become lovers of mammon or of matter and loving all of that experience, in a kind of idolatry. But it is important that we take that. There are a lot of other things we could have gotten into, but I just didn't have time to go any further. So next time we'll continue on with the story from Zurvanism and carry it another step or two further. And then I think we have about 3 more talks. We have a little bit more to do just on some other simple principles, more practical. We eventually get to practical things left for the last minute or two. But some other practical thing. We'll finish the story up, and then we have some other practical things on vertical dualism. And then we have one more on another type of dualism that is neither vertical nor horizontal, but it takes in both. And then, well, that'll sort of fuse it all together, I hope. No questions?
One.
Yes.
Could one say that the reason that Ahriman was first born was because man descended into matter first?
We are, in terms of this cosmic creation in which we are part of, the seers claim that we are the first, we are, as Paul says, a peculiar people. We are the first that started in this creation to come to waking consciousness at the depth of matter in the realms of Ahriman. Our humanity is that. Yeah, we happen to be very lucky to be in a very special place that way. We're not phased off. We may be a little phased out, but we're not phased off.
You're still going to try to fit in manichaeism at the end?